It is Wednesday, July 24th, 2019. I'm Gord Long. As is normally the case, we have a lot of charts for us to go through, so therefore we will pass over some of them quickly, but leave you to examine them further at your leisure. You'll need to open your viewer to full screen viewing, or you'll not be able to see some of the detail I'll be discussing in the charts. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. This month, I'd like to update our tipping points as part of our triannual global risk developments. As such, I'd like to discuss the areas highlighted here. At mid-year, we felt it was time to update our 2019 tipping points. As has become the pattern over the last 10 years, we continue to see the overall number of tipping points increasing. The bottom line for this is problems are not being resolved, but rather are being papered over by our leaders, while the problematic cans continue to be kicked down the road. The number of tipping points has increased by 6 this year to a total of 50. When we first started this research methodology, there were less than half this number, which in itself is quite telling. The high-risk category also continues to rise in number. Both a new tipping point and an addition to the overall number of tipping points is number 6, tariffs and trade wars. Modern globalization is facing its first threat to growth via tariffs and trade wars with the action of U.S. President Donald Trump. It has been close to 100 years since the last period when tariffs and trade wars were perceived as effective policy initiatives. Time will tell if its proven record of failure is different this time. Number 13 is de-dollarization. The weaponization of the U.S. dollar via sanctions is forcing increasing numbers of countries to reduce their U.S. dollar reserve holdings and look for safer alternatives. As we spelled out in this year's thesis paper, we believe this trend will have profound global ramifications over the next 10 years as a dollar as the global reserve currency and the U.S. Treasury bond as a global risk datum become fragile and no longer offer the global financial security they once did. Our 2012 thesis paper on financial repression outlined the macroprudential economic policies that have come to be labeled financial repression. It fostered me co-founding the Financial Repression Authority and its website, which tracks these developments such as QE, QQE, MMT et al. All have taken global thinking and policies into completely untested and dangerous waters. We have added advancing financial repression as a new tipping point since we foresee even more bizarre policies in the future in an attempt to forestall an inevitable fiat currency collapse. The damage these reactive policies is doing in underpinning the capitalist system is something I have personally been writing on since the financial crisis, and it can only be described as monetary malpractice. But the central bankers, in my opinion, are still early in using tools to extend and manipulate the economic, business, and credit cycles in an effort to stop an over-leveraged economy from collapsing as the debt supercycle comes to an end. In the area of moderate risk, we have added 4 new tipping points as numbers 37 through 40. Number 37, the European Union experiment, is proving to be a failure with cracks in political discourse evident across the EU. In 2010, 2011, I actually wrote extensively on why I thought this would end up being a failure, the total EU approach. That is the separation of monetary and fiscal policies. We believe the EU banking system is in a perilous situation. That's number 7 in our tipping points, and will only add, like Brexit, Italian fiscal compliance issues, emergence of anti-EU political parties, and tax revolts like the Yellow Jackets in France. Number 38 is insufficient global economic growth is pressuring sovereign states to resort to competitive currency devaluation. This will only get worse. Number 39, the growth of zombie corporations is unparalleled in history. When 10 to 20% of global corporations, according to the Bank of International Settlement, now have to borrow to pay the interest on their over-leveraged balance sheets, we know something is seriously wrong. A bankruptcy of one corporation can have a contagious effect. Bad debt would have to be written off. Instead of too big to fail, we now have too many to fail, and that's the problem. That's why we don't see bankruptcies like we used to see. They're being papered over. The electorate across the globe are losing confidence in the system and their political leadership. Failed political governance has broken the unwritten social contract between the electorate and their political ruling class. The low-risking tipping points had no change, but all are only simmering, and any could erupt at any time. We've been showing this matrix since the financial crisis in 2008. At that time, we were in the top left box where the financial crisis was primarily a U.S. housing-driven crisis but had profound global consequences, nevertheless, because the U.S. was still, at that time, the global economic leader. That has changed in the last 10 years, and quite dramatically. Tipping points have been mutating and growing to become not only regional, but global in nature. We still believe, as we did when we first constructed this grid, that the approximately $600 trillion over-the-counter, unregulated global interest and currency swaps market will someday be the tipping point that leads to a global fiat currency collapse. That day is still in the future, but increasingly more assured that it is coming. Crisis of trust in political leadership and governance, rising populism, more authoritarian policies are all political problems we didn't have 10 years ago. Not only are the tipping points moving from country level to global in nature, but financial to political in nature. Both trends mean future crises will be significantly more problematic, complex, and devastatingly destructive. We have to face the reality that years of easy money has only brought demand forward, leaving a black hole of slowing consumption and overcapacity. This is to be expected and was understood when we put measures such as quantitative easing in place to bring that demand forward. We kicked the can down the road for so long that many believe the business cycle is dead and recessions won't occur because of monetary and fiscal actions that can be taken. That is a notion that will soon be left in the trash heap of flawed thinking. As a result of debt growing faster than our underlying economy, America's debt as a percentage of GDP soared from just over 150% in the early 1980s to approximately 350% in recent years. This higher debt burden is the reason why our economy simply cannot handle interest rates as high as they were before 2008. The debt supercycle is coming to an end under its own weight. We have an $84 trillion unfunded entitlements problem in the U.S. and a $210 trillion fiscal gap. Globally, underfunded pensions and entitlements amount to close to $400 trillion. These are inextinguishable debt obligations that will create profound financial, economic, and political changes with their inevitable resolution. We have built Western economies where consumer spending in our new creditism system versus our prior capitalist system is now dependent on government transfer payments to continue to exist. We have a gutted, dependent middle class that soon will no longer be able to be supported by the existing taxation system. Global population growth is falling with profound implications towards growth of consumption and economic viability of existing social policies. The shift of the world from a unipolar world with U.S. economic, political, and security leadership is being replaced with a multipolar world in the context of a new world order. This will challenge the bedrock that our global financial systems have been built on and are still very much dependent on. We have been living in an era of globalization and deflation since the turn of the century and the entry of China's 1.2 billion workers into the World Trade Organization. Soon, the deflation we have come to depend on regarding manufacturing goods will slow and possibly reverse. Domestic-based services will become the producer of real inflation, and that's already happening. Slow growth and inflation engendered in the term stagflation is likely ahead in the years to come, where the debt leverage that has created financial market bubbles will have to be worked off. It is too early yet, but all indications are that our 2010 thesis will be entitled Fiat Failure. We have consistently been 3 to 5 years ahead on our thesis papers. Hopefully this will again be the case and give our subscribers time to prepare for what is coming. The fiat currency failure we put together years ago unfortunately continues to track almost exactly as predicted. It is like a train on a track with only one destination. A CEO, in describing how his company went broke, said, and I quote, "Slow at first, then all of a sudden." That is the stage we're currently in. Stage 1, likely through this year and part of next year. The following slow-moving glacier is what to expect. Escalating and broadening trade wars and tariffs would continue to act as a U.S. consumption tax. unfunded liabilities coming due, underfunded public and private pensions coming due, contingent liability as part of the $210 trillion fiscal gap being triggered in countries that are dependent on U.S. largesse, falling productivity improvements, lowering standard of living as buybacks continue to redirect capital away from productive assets and into financial engineering, employment income growth continue to devastate the middle class and bottom 40% lifestyles within a U.S. 70% consumption-based economy, and the U.S. facing its first recession in over a decade with historic levels of leveraged corporate debt on the books. Stage 2 likely between late next year and 2021. The U.S. and most developed economies will experience a steady decline in standards of living. Tax revenues will continue to shrink, fiscal expenses will mount, U.S. dollar will begin to weaken with advancing de-dollarization and U.S. credit downgrades. Price inflation will become a real concern. We'll realize that economic stagnation and stagflation can't be fixed by deficit stimulus. We will experience a sudden and unexpected surge in sovereign debt levels, which can't be financed. Stage 3, which is probably between 2022 and 2024, will see that the U.S. begins to experience hyperinflation and a real crack-up boom as the currency loses its exorbitant privilege. U.S. dollar falls significantly as confidence is lost in the U.S. economy and leadership. Price inflation surges as goods become more expensive. Yields rise rapidly. Government funding expenses soar to simply unmanageable levels in 2025. In a massive global rebalancing, the U.S. dollar becomes part of a global reserve currency basket. Of course, all of this is premised on us not experiencing a shooting war, which is often a result of these sorts of financial, economic, and political dislocations. With 50 tipping points, it can fairly confidently be surmised that something is going to destabilize an unbalanced and fragile global house of cards. Be prepared for this, plan accordingly, and get a good financial strategy in place now while there's still plenty of time. In closing, as I always remind you, remember the answer will be to continue to print more and more money. It is the only answer politicians will ever agree on. Until that is, no one wants it or simply doesn't trust it. Invest accordingly. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2019 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. I sincerely thank you for listening.